Welcome to the Sleeping Tycoon. Tonight we tell the story of a man who did not dream in images, but in logic. A boy who saw the world not as mystery, but as pattern. Lines of cause and effect waiting to be arranged into order. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't a rebel. He was something rarer. A thinker who believed that brilliance meant nothing unless it could be taught to a machine. This is the story of Bill Gates, a quiet boy from Seattle who would one day build an empire from code, and in doing so change the rhythm of modern life itself. From the hum of his first computer terminal at Lakeside School to the fluorescent nights at Microsoft's early offices, his life was measured not in years, but in progress. Each breakthrough, another heartbeat of the digital age. He was the architect of an invisible empire software that would run the world's thoughts, interfaces that would shape its habits, and ideas that would make the future feel inevitable. But beyond the code and contracts lies a more human truth. The story of a man learning that intelligence alone cannot heal the world, and that empathy, not data, may be the final algorithm worth solving. As you listen, let the sounds of the day fade. Let the mind slow to the rhythm of invention. There is no noise here, only the steady hum of thought and the quiet persistence of a man who taught machines to serve humanity. Close your eyes and drift into the story of Bill Gates, the architect of the digital age. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Asked Why. Seattle, 1955. He was born in a city of rain and pine where the clouds hung low and the air smelled of salt from Puget Sound. William Henry Gates III arrived in October 1955, the son of a determined attorney and a mother whose kindness hid a formidable will. His home on North 32nd Street was orderly, filled with books and quiet ambition. At dinner, ideas were debated like sport. His father spoke of fairness, his mother of service. Both believed intellect carried responsibility. Bill listened more than he spoke, eyes flickering behind large glasses, already dissecting the world into patterns. He loved to read encyclopedias, atlases, science fiction. When other children played outside, he sat cross-legged on the carpet with volumes stacked around him, traveling through pages instead of streets. He devoured information the way others breathed, and always, when something puzzled him, he would ask why. At school, he was quick, restless, occasionally defiant. Teachers called him brilliant, but impossible to manage. A mind that refused to idle. He once finished a math textbook weeks ahead of schedule and demanded a harder one. Structure could not contain him. He was propelled by internal momentum. His parents, sensing both danger and promise, moved him to Lakeside School, a private academy known for academic rigor. It would become the crucible of his life. There, among brick halls and cedar trees, the 13-year-old boy met his first true love, a computer terminal. In 1968, Lakeside's Mothers Club raised money to install a teletype terminal connected to a distant mainframe. The device sat humming in the basement, a beige box with clattering keys and a roll of paper that whispered code in cryptic streams. For most students, it was curiosity. For Bill Gates, it was revelation. He described it later as falling through a portal into another world. Here was a machine that obeyed pure reason. No emotion, no politics, only logic. Type a command, and the universe answered with precision. To a mind obsessed with order, It felt like home. He spent every spare hour at that terminal writing lines of BASIC on endless paper rolls, studying how tiny symbols could shape behavior. The sound of keys became the pulse of his days. He skipped gym class, meals, sometimes sleep. His curiosity had found electricity. Soon he found companions. Paul Allen, 2 years older and equally consumed by curiosity. Kent Evans, a brilliant classmate with quick humor, and Rick Wyland, quiet, methodical. Together they formed an unlikely brotherhood, the Lakeside Programmers Club. They weren't rebels, they were explorers. They spent nights testing system limits, discovering both how to use and how to break them. When they accidentally exploited time-sharing loopholes to gain extra computer access, they were banned from the system. Their punishment? To help fix the bugs they'd uncovered. It was their first lesson in negotiation, how breaking rules could lead to building better ones. Gates quickly realized that programming wasn't just mathematics. It was creation. It gave him the ability to build invisible machines inside other machines. He loved the precision. One misplaced semicolon and the system would collapse. Control through clarity, failure through haste. That balance of fragility and power fascinated him. He began keeping notebooks filled with algorithms and improvement ideas. He timed himself, racing to solve problems faster. At 14, he was already training like an athlete of intellect. When a local company offered computer time in exchange for help detecting software bugs, the boys accepted instantly. They worked for free access, living on Coca-Cola and curiosity. Each hour spent coding was another step away from childhood. Tragedy came quietly one spring. Kent Evans, Gates's closest friend and coding partner, died in a climbing accident. For the first time, the world that had felt limitless showed its edge. Bill withdrew, grieving not with tears, but with work. He began to see time as finite, potential as perishable. If life could vanish overnight, then creation had to happen now. Urgency replaced innocence. By 17, Gates and Paul Allen had built a device called Data, a small machine that analyzed traffic flow tapes for local governments. They used an early Intel processor, soldering circuits by hand, writing software to automate analysis once done manually. It worked, mostly. The project earned them a few $100s, but its true profit was perspective. They had proven they could build something real, something that solved a tangible problem. Later, Gates would laugh about Data's modest success, calling it a first pancake, slightly burnt but edible. But deep down, it confirmed what he already suspected. The future would belong to those who understood software, not hardware. In 1973, Gates entered Harvard University, not because he needed it, but because that's what brilliant young men were expected to do. He studied mathematics and computer science, occasionally attending classes, mostly haunting the computer lab. There he met Steve Ballmer, whose booming energy contrasted his quiet precision. They became unlikely friends, a duo that would one day steer Microsoft's empire. Harvard exposed Gates to thinkers, but also to limits. He grew impatient with theory. While professors debated the elegance of algorithms, he was already thinking about how they might reshape the real world. The campus around him moved at human speed. He was running in machine time. In 1975, a magazine arrived in the Harvard dorms, Popular Electronics. On its cover, the Altair 8800, a small blue computer kit, beckoned like prophecy. For the first time, personal computing felt possible. Gates showed the issue to Alan. Both stared in silence, feeling the gravity of the moment. This was the door they had been waiting for. Within hours, they called MITS, the company behind the Altair, claiming they had written a version of BASIC for it. They hadn't. They just knew they could. For 8 feverish weeks, they wrote the code from scratch. When Alan flew to Albuquerque to test it, the program ran perfectly on the first try. History rarely grants such symmetry, imagination meeting execution in a single keystroke. Gates never returned to Harvard. He was polite about it. He simply never looked back. The future was no longer in lectures, but in laboratories and living rooms, in the hum of processors and the promise of access for everyone. At 20, he had already answered his childhood question of why. Now he was ready for the next one. How far? In the quiet basement of a school, a boy had learned that logic could move the world. By the time he left Harvard, that boy had become an architect, designing not buildings, but possibility. He did not yet know what Microsoft would become or how profoundly his code would shape humanity's habits, but he knew the rhythm of creation. He knew that clarity could be built from chaos, and that every great empire begins not with ambition, but with curiosity. The boy who asked why was ready to show the world how. Chapter 2. In the winter of 1975, the snow fell quietly on Harvard Yard. Inside a small dorm room, cluttered with papers and half-finished math assignments, Bill Gates stared at a magazine cover that seemed to hum with possibility. Popular Electronics, January 1975. Across its front, a blue box, the Altair 8800, the world's first personal computer kit. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even friendly. It was a box of switches and blinking lights, yet to Gates and his friend Paul Allen, it was revelation. Here, at last, was proof that the dream of computing for everyone had left the laboratory. Not mainframes hidden in corporations, but machines on desks, perhaps someday in homes. Alan looked at Gates and said quietly, "This is it." Gates didn't answer at first. His eyes were fixed on the page, already seeing a future written in binary. Within days, the two began planning. They would write a version of the BASIC programming language for the Altair. No one had asked them to. They simply assumed the world would need it. They had no Altair to test on, no company, and almost no money. But they had hunger and time. Harvard's computer lab became their workshop. They worked through nights that bled into mornings, translating logic into code line by line. Gates typed relentlessly, his focus absolute. Alan designed the emulator that would mimic the Altair inside Harvard's mainframe. The room smelled of coffee and ozone. Some nights the fluorescent lights flickered and the clatter of keys was the only sound. When Gates finally paused, he would pace the hallway, lips moving silently as he replayed lines of code from memory. He carried whole programs in his head. The project became their entire world. They called it Altair Basic, a bridge between people and the machine, a way for anyone to instruct a computer in plain language. After 8 feverish weeks, they were ready. In March 1975, Alan boarded a plane to Albuquerque carrying a stack of punched paper tape, their entire creation. Gates stayed behind, too nervous to watch. If the program failed, their dream ended before it began. At MITS headquarters, Alan loaded the tape into the Altair. The machine flickered, paused, and then, like the first breath of a new species, responded. Ready. The code worked perfectly. For the first time, a personal computer spoke a human word of obedience. Alan phoned Gates from the desert and said it ran on the first try. Gates exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. In that single heartbeat, Microsoft was born. They incorporated soon after. Microsoft, a blend of microcomputer and software. At first, the hyphen stayed. Later, it vanished. Their office was a small room in Albuquerque near the MITS plant. Bare walls, humming terminals, the smell of solder. They slept on couches, ate at diners, and lived for the click of keys. Clients were scarce, money tighter still, but there was joy in the scarcity. Two young men building the language of a new world. Each contract felt like proof that imagination could pay the rent. Gates handled the business calls, writing letters with precision beyond his years. Alan wrote code that gleamed with efficiency. Together they were balance, logic and vision, intensity and calm. At night they talked about the future, computers small enough for every home, programs as common as books, the world connected by invisible logic. The idea felt impossible and inevitable. In that tiny office, Gates set the rhythm. He arrived early, left late, and often slept beneath his desk. He reviewed every line of code before release, pencil tapping to an inaudible metronome. But the tone was still light then, curiosity before empire. They joked, played music through tinny speakers, debated syntax like poets. When a bug appeared, they stayed until dawn, chasing it down. They weren't just solving errors, they were taming mystery. Alan later said those years felt like living inside a frontier. Everything was being invented at once. Every solved problem revealed another untouched horizon. The late 1970s brought a surge of machines. Commodore, Tandy, Apple, all hungry for software. Most programmers wrote for fun, few understood licensing. Gates did. He saw software not as product but as intellectual property, something that could be sold, scaled, protected. It was an insight that would later redefine business itself. When hobbyists began sharing copies of Microsoft Basic without paying, Gates wrote his famous open letter to hobbyists. It wasn't anger, it was logic. He argued that good software required time, and time deserved value. It was an early glimpse of the pragmatist he would become, idealism anchored by precision. By 1979, Microsoft had outgrown Albuquerque. The desert had given them birth. Now they needed water, infrastructure, talent. They packed their terminals and flew north to Seattle, the city where Gates had first stared at the rain and wondered why. The company dropped its hyphen, added employees, and rented an office overlooking Lake Washington. There were about a dozen of them, young, exhausted, alive. No suits, no hierarchy, just the hum of creation. They believed they were building something timeless, though none could yet describe it. Gates and Alan's friendship deepened through friction and faith. They argued often about architecture, deadlines, perfection, but always in service of the work. Alan admired Gates's mind, fast, unrelenting, surgical. Gates admired Alan's imagination, wide, intuitive, musical. When their arguments cooled, they would laugh, order pizza, and dive back into code. They shared a quiet certainty that the world was changing around them and that they were helping to write the script On summer nights, they stood outside the office watching planes descend through mist, and Gates would say softly, "Someday, every one of those people will have a computer of their own." It sounded like prophecy. As contracts grew, so did recognition. Magazines began to write about the young men building the language of personal computing. Gates's parents read the articles with pride and cautious concern. Their son, still barely in his 20s, commanding a technology few adults understood. Investors started to call. Hardware manufacturers asked for customized software. Each new client meant more employees, more late nights, more coffee, but the rhythm remained gentle. They weren't chasing wealth. They were chasing possibility. Money was a byproduct of clarity. When asked about ambition, Gates simply said, "I want to see what happens when everyone can think faster." To Gates, programming was not mechanical. It was creative discipline. He saw beauty in logic, symmetry in algorithms, poetry in precision. He once told Alan, "Code is a story we tell the machine. If we tell it well enough, it tells one back." That philosophy shaped the early Microsoft culture. Engineers were storytellers, the machine their reader. Every new line of BASIC, Fortran, or COBOL was another sentence in humanity's dialogue with technology. And in that dialogue, Gates began to hear music. The rhythm of an idea that would one day orchestrate the digital age. By the close of the decade, personal computing was no longer a curiosity. It was an ecosystem in bloom. Microprocessors grew cheaper, memory expanded, demand exploded. Gates and Allen stood at the crossroads of a revolution they had helped ignite. They knew they were still small, fewer than 20 employees, barely profitable. But they also knew something larger was unfolding, something irreversible. They were not just writing software, they were teaching the world to think in logic. Every keystroke, every contract, every sleepless night drew the map of a future still unnamed. One evening in 1979, after everyone had gone home, Gates remained at his desk overlooking the lake. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the water. He could hear rain tapping against the glass. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and thought of the lakeside terminal, the whir of the Altair, the flight to Albuquerque. The moment the machine had said, "Ready," he realized how improbable it all was. How a few lines of code could lead to a company, how curiosity could evolve into creation. He smiled faintly. Then he turned off the light and left the office, his footsteps echoing in a room still warm with electricity. Two young men had taken logic and turned it into language. From the hum of a terminal in Albuquerque, they had written the first words of a new civilization. They didn't yet know that their small office would one day command the operating systems of the world. They didn't see fortune or fame. They saw puzzles waiting to be solved. Their days were measured in lines of code, their nights in quiet triumphs, their dreams in the steady pulse of invention. And as the decade turned, the boy who had once asked why was beginning to teach the world how to think. The code breakers had built their language. Now they would build their world. Chapter 3. The year was 1980. Seattle's skyline was still modest then, cranes rising beside fishing docks, the hum of industry layered over rain. Inside a nondescript office near Lake Washington, the 24-year-old Bill Gates paced between terminals, a mug of cold coffee in his hand, eyes alive with calculation. Microsoft was no longer a dream scribbled on dorm paper. It was a company, small, growing, stubbornly independent. Gates led fewer than 50 people. Yet he carried himself as though the fate of computing already rested in his mind. They had written languages for hobbyists, for early PCS, for machines few people outside laboratories even recognized. But Gates could feel the pressure of change. The personal computer was about to leave the hobby shop and enter the office. And when it did, whoever wrote its language would write history. That summer, a visitor arrived from IBM. The International Business Machines Corporation was a colossus, blue-suited, methodical, decades older than its would-be partners. IBM wanted to build a new personal computer, small, fast, mass market, and they needed software to make it sing. Gates was courteous but cautious. He knew IBM's culture, vast, bureaucratic, slow. Microsoft was the opposite, young, restless, sleepless. But opportunity rarely came twice. He listened carefully, head tilted, hands in pockets. What IBM wanted was an operating system, the invisible layer between machine and user. They needed it fast. Gates didn't yet have one, but he knew where to find it. Gates contacted a small Seattle company called Seattle Computer Products, which owned a modest program named QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System. He negotiated quietly, bought the rights, and began to refine it. When IBM's executives returned, Gates presented the system as if it were Microsoft's own. He renamed it MS-DOS. But his genius wasn't in the code. It was in the contract. Instead of selling the software outright, he licensed it to IBM, keeping the rights to sell it to others. It was a decision that would ripple through history. As IBM's machines spread across the world, every clone that followed would also need Microsoft's software. In one elegant move, Gates had transformed Microsoft from a supplier into the backbone of a new industry. The world didn't yet notice, but the fuse had been lit. The 1980s arrived with fluorescent light and optimism. Every month brought new computers, Compaq, Dell, Zenith, HP. Each ran on the same quiet heart, MS-DOS. Inside Microsoft, the mood was electric. Employees were young, idealistic, and slightly feral. They slept under desks, argued over syntax, survived on pizza and Pepsi. Gates moved among them like a conductor, seeing bugs others missed, rewriting code in the margins. He demanded precision, but rewarded brilliance. Mistakes were tolerated once, never twice, and beneath his intensity was something deeper, a belief that their work mattered. They weren't just building programs, they were giving shape to the next century. DOS was not beautiful. It was a blinking cursor on a black screen, cold and logical. But to those who understood it, it was liberation, a portal into the machine's mind. Still, Gates knew the world needed something simpler. Most people would never type code. They would point, click, imagine. Somewhere out there, he believed, someone was building that vision. He was right. In Cupertino, Apple was crafting the Macintosh, a computer with icons, windows, and a mouse. Its interface looked like art compared to Microsoft's stoic text. Gates watched with admiration and unease. He once said, "We always knew graphical interfaces were the future." The only question was, whose future? In 1981, Gates visited Apple headquarters. He admired their innovation, but saw gaps, fragility, limited software, high prices. Microsoft, he thought, could provide the bridge between creativity and scale. He offered Apple a suite of programs, Excel, Word, and others, built to run on the Macintosh. Steve Jobs, passionate and mercurial, welcomed him. The two men, one fire, one logic, walked side by side through Apple's labs, each seeing the other as both ally and rival. Jobs called Gates a bandit. Gates called Jobs a magician. Both were right. What neither realized was that history was quietly aligning them toward conflict and transformation. By 1983, Microsoft unveiled its vision, a new interface layered over DOS filled with windows, icons, and color. They called it Windows. It wasn't yet refined, not even stable, but it was a glimpse of the future, an operating system for everyone, not just experts. When Jobs accused him of copying Apple, Gates replied evenly, "Well, Steve, I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV, but you beat me to it." It was humor laced with truth. Both had borrowed from the same source, but Gates's strategy was different. Make it open, make it affordable, make it everywhere. That philosophy would soon transform Microsoft from a software shop into an empire. Through it all, Gates remained remarkably consistent. He still drove modest cars, still dressed like a student, still preferred logic to ceremony. His office was cluttered with papers, diagrams, and half-empty soda cans. He didn't lead with charisma, he led with clarity. Each morning, he made lists, problems to solve, code to review, people to push harder. He memorized data the way others memorized faces. He saw the company as an operating system. Every process must connect, every inefficiency removed. When asked how he kept focus amid chaos, he replied, "You just keep asking what matters most, and then do it." It sounded simple, but few could match his discipline. For those who worked there, early Microsoft felt like an expedition. They weren't employees, they were explorers on a digital frontier. Meetings happened at midnight. Arguments over architecture echoed through the hallways. No one cared about titles, only competence counted. They believed they were democratizing power, putting tools once reserved for corporations into the hands of ordinary people. Each line of code felt like a brushstroke on a vast canvas. In interviews, Gates rarely spoke of wealth. He spoke of potential. Someday, every desk, every home will have a computer. That's when we'll know we've done our job. To most, it sounded absurd. To him, it was inevitability. As DOS and early Windows spread, an invisible revolution began. Secretaries became typists of data, students became creators, offices became ecosystems of silicon and light. The same command that had once blinked on black screens now powered governments, hospitals, and classrooms. The digital world was no longer niche, it was necessity. In homes across America, boxes bearing the Microsoft logo appeared beside beige monitors. Children learned their first words of technology. Click, save, enter. Gates watched quietly, knowing the dream of accessibility was finally real. He said, "The PC is the bicycle of the mind. Once you learn to ride it, you can go anywhere." But even as Microsoft soared, Gates and Paul Allen began to drift. Allen's health faltered. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. While he recovered, tensions grew. Gates, driven by precision, sometimes pushed too hard. Alan, weary, began to step back. By 1983, Alan left the company. He remained a friend, but the partnership that had birthed Microsoft was over. Gates felt the absence deeply, though he rarely showed it. He threw himself into work, filling silence with code. Years later, he would say, "Without Paul, there would be no Microsoft." We shared a vision long before we shared success. The release of Windows 1.0 arrived that year. Clunky, slow, underwhelming. Reviewers mocked it. Competitors dismissed it. But Gates saw beyond its flaws. He knew first versions were seeds, not monuments. He told his team, "This is the start of something that will take a decade. Keep improving. The rest of the world will catch up." He was right. Version 2 improved, then 3.0 exploded. By the early 1990s, Windows had become the operating system of the planet. But in the mid-1980s, it was still fragile hope. A window cracked open to the light of the coming age. Away from the machines, Gates began to build a life. He met Melinda French, a bright product manager whose steadiness balanced his intensity. They shared a belief that intellect should serve purpose. She admired his focus. He admired her patience. Together they would one day turn wealth into instrument of change. But in these early years, there was little luxury of reflection. The world was moving fast, and Microsoft was its engine. Each morning the parking lot filled before dawn. From the outside, it looked like obsession. From the inside, it felt like destiny. As Microsoft grew, so did Gates. The curious boy had become an executive, though he still saw himself as a coder at heart. He rarely spoke in slogans. He preferred diagrams and logic. He distrusted ceremony but valued precision. He began to understand that leadership was just another form of programming, aligning people instead of processes, debugging culture instead of code. He said once, half smiling, "The computer is predictable. Humans take a bit more time." He wasn't wrong. By the end of the decade, Microsoft had become the dominant force in software. The company's logo appeared on every office shelf, its code inside every machine. The boy who once asked why had given the world a new language, and the world had begun to answer. Gates still arrived early, still memorized schedules, still asked impossible questions. But sometimes, late at night, he would stand by the window of his corner office, watching the city lights flicker like pixels on a vast screen. He wondered how far logic could take humanity before chaos reclaimed it. For now, though, the world was running smoothly, powered by software, guided by precision, and written in part by his own steady hand. In a single decade, a company of dreamers had turned logic into landscape. Their code ran through governments and classrooms, through factories and homes. The hum of the microprocessor had become the soundtrack of civilization. Bill Gates was no longer just a coder. He was an architect, building not machines, but a new kind of mind. The boy from Seattle had given humanity its most powerful tool, a window through which the world could see itself. The code breakers had opened their window to the world, and through it, the future began to look back. Chapter 4. By the early 1990s, Microsoft was no longer a hopeful startup. It was a rhythm pulsing through the veins of the global economy. The company's headquarters in Redmond, Washington, stretched across forested land, low buildings of glass and steel surrounded by fir trees. Employees rode bicycles between offices. Whiteboards were filled with equations and deadlines. The air smelled faintly of coffee, ozone, and ambition. Everywhere, screens flickered to life with a familiar blue glow. Windows. The name had become more than a product. It was a portal through which the world now worked, learned, played, and dreamed. The boy from Seattle had written a language that billions now spoke, even if they didn't know it. Inside Microsoft, the tempo never slowed. There was always another release, another patch, another innovation waiting just beyond the horizon. Gates still walked the halls with a mug in one hand and a notepad in the other, memorizing lines of code, reviewing schedules, interrupting meetings with sharp questions that sliced through vagueness like light through glass. He could dismantle an idea in seconds, rebuild it in minutes, and demand its prototype by morning. Some found him intimidating, others found him magnetic, all found him impossible to ignore. To Gates, efficiency was not cruelty, it was clarity. He once told a new hire, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough." The phrase spread through the company like scripture. In 1990, Microsoft released Windows 3.0, the first truly polished version of its interface. It was faster, smoother, colorful. For the first time, computing felt friendly. Sales surged. By year's end, it was the best-selling software in history. Suddenly, Microsoft wasn't just a company, it was a culture. The world's offices, universities, and homes now lived on its code. The company's market value soared past $2 billion. Gates, still only 35, became one of the youngest billionaires in history. He showed little interest in celebration. Instead, he asked when 3.1 would be ready. Microsoft's culture hardened into identity. Sharp minds, long hours, restless purpose. It was a meritocracy of logic, one's worth measured not by charm, but by contribution. Gates's closest lieutenants, Steve Ballmer, the exuberant strategist, Nathan Myhrvold, the intellectual futurist, Jeff Rakes, the diplomat of software, each embodied a piece of his personality. They worked with near religious devotion. The days blurred into nights, illuminated by the glow of CRT monitors. Some engineers joked that they lived inside the software itself, eating, thinking, and dreaming in code, but none complained. They believed, as Gates did, that they were building something that would outlast them. By 1993, the Internet, once a network for scientists, began to reach ordinary people. It was raw, chaotic, infinite. To Gates, it felt familiar. Another uncharted frontier waiting to be organized. He predicted that connectivity would define the next decade. To his employees, he said, "The information highway is coming faster than anyone thinks." Microsoft pivoted quickly. They built browsers, mail clients, and tools for the web. Competitors struggled to match the pace. The company seemed unstoppable. August 1995. The world watched as Windows 95 launched like a cultural event. Lines stretched outside stores at midnight. Television commercials played to the tune of "Start Me Up" by the Rolling Stones. News anchors spoke of software the way they once spoke of moon landings. When Gates stepped on stage at the launch, he looked almost embarrassed by the spectacle. He smiled, adjusted his glasses, and said simply, "Welcome to the next generation of computing." Behind him, the screen lit up with the new Start button, a small square of color that would become the most recognized icon of the modern age. Windows 95 sold 7 million copies in 5 weeks. It unified home and work, play and productivity. It turned the computer into a household object, as ordinary as a lamp, as essential as light. By 1996, Microsoft's value had skyrocketed. Its software ran on more than 80% of the world's computers. Bill Gates' personal fortune surpassed $40 billion. He had become the richest man alive, a title he neither sought nor celebrated. When journalists asked how it felt, he answered, "It's a responsibility, not an achievement." His home near Lake Washington was modern and understated, filled not with gold or marble, but with screens, servers, and a digital library he called The Retreat. He spent most days at the office anyway. Friends described him as unchanged. Same humor, same old sweaters, same obsession with learning. Wealth hadn't softened him. It had given him scale, but even in triumph, new battles emerged. Across Silicon Valley, a young company called Netscape had created the Navigator browser, the first to bring the internet to the masses. Overnight, it became the new gatekeeper of access. For the first time, Microsoft seemed behind. The web was not Windows. It lived outside the empire. Gates refused to accept that. He ordered an internal internet tidal wave memo, a rallying cry. Every team was told, make Microsoft the leader of the internet age. Within months, they released Internet Explorer, integrated directly into Windows. It wasn't just strategy, it was inevitability. Soon, Explorer dominated and Netscape faded. To some, it was victory. To others, it was warning. By 1998, Microsoft's reach was unmatched. Its software powered the world's communication, commerce, and creativity. Banks, hospitals, governments all ran on Windows. The company's stock value crossed $500 billion, making it the most valuable in history. It employed over 30,000 people across 60 countries. And yet, Gates still reviewed memos by hand, red pen in margin, perfection in every note. He had built an empire of logic, an invisible infrastructure upon which modern life now stood. He once said, "We're not building monuments, we're building foundations." And indeed, Microsoft was not a statue. It was circuitry, language, momentum. To outsiders, Gates seemed mechanical, precise, tireless, unshakable. But those who knew him saw something gentler, a dry humor, a boyish curiosity, an almost shy decency. He devoured books on physics, history, and economics. He loved long walks around the campus lake, thinking aloud in half sentences. He admired Einstein and Buffett, men who turned simplicity into philosophy. He once said, "I measure success by the impact we have on others, not the noise we make." Still, the noise around him was growing. As Microsoft's influence spread, regulators began to ask questions. Competitors complained that integrating Internet Explorer into Windows was unfair, a quiet dominance disguised as convenience. Journalists began using a new phrase, monopoly. Gates rejected the label. He argued that innovation was open to all, that competition was a sign of progress, not proof of power. Yet behind his calm, there was unease. For the first time, The empire he'd built from curiosity faced suspicion instead of admiration. The Department of Justice began to investigate. The Code of Empire was about to meet the law of consequence. In quieter moments, Gates sometimes looked back. He thought of the teletype terminal at Lakeside, of Paul Allen, of the boy who had stared at the green cursor and felt infinite possibility. The world that boy imagined had arrived, and yet it came with noise, scrutiny, and moral weight. He told Melinda one evening, "I just want to make sure we're still doing good work." She smiled and said, "You've already done more than you know." But Gates wasn't sure. Progress, to him, was never final. In 1999, Microsoft reached its zenith. Its revenues exceeded $20 billion. Its operating systems ran on 90% of computers worldwide. Its logo had become a global language. Gates, now in his early 40s, had achieved more than most civilizations in a lifetime. And yet, he still carried himself like a student. Eyes behind glasses, notebook in hand, always learning. He wasn't building wealth anymore. He was building permanence. He wanted the digital world to endure, to keep expanding long after his name faded from the login screen. The empire of logic was complete, and somewhere in that quiet success, the seeds of humility began to stir. He had built the architecture of modern life, invisible, infinite, exact. Every click, every command, every calculation carried a trace of his logic. He had turned curiosity into civilization. The boy from Seattle had grown into the mind behind a new epoch. And though the world now ran on his code, he still saw himself as a student of patterns, watching, learning, refining. But soon, even he would be forced to step back and ask a new question. What happens when power outgrows purpose? The empire of logic was built, and on the horizon, the storm began to move. Chapter 5. In the late 1990s, Microsoft stood at the peak of its power. Its products shaped the daily rhythm of the world. Billions of keystrokes, millions of screens, every window framed by the company's invisible code. But power, like gravity, attracts its own resistance. In 1998, the United States Department of Justice filed suit against Microsoft, accusing it of violating antitrust laws, of using its dominance to crush competitors and stifle innovation. For the first time, the architect of the digital age stood on trial, not in a courtroom of peers, but in the court of history. Bill Gates, precise, analytical, fiercely logical, could not quite believe it. To him, Microsoft was not a monopoly. It was momentum. It was the natural evolution of good ideas executed well. He had always measured progress by function, not fear. But suddenly, the world around him was asking a different question. Had his empire grown too perfect? Had efficiency become control? The boy who once asked why was now being asked how far. The case unfolded in Washington, D.C. under fluorescent lights and public glare. Journalists called it the trial of the century. Gates testified via video deposition, his tone confident, his answers clipped, his logic impenetrable. But to the public, his confidence read as arrogance. Clips of his deposition circulated on television, stripped of context, painting him as cold, evasive, mechanical. He was used to being the smartest man in the room. Now he was the most scrutinized, Each question felt like a puzzle, but this time logic could not solve perception. His lawyers spoke of markets, the press spoke of morality. The narrative had shifted. Microsoft was no longer the underdog of innovation. It was the giant of dominance. Inside the courtroom, Gates appeared calm. Inside himself, he felt the walls closing in. In 2000, the court delivered its verdict. Microsoft had indeed violated antitrust laws. The company, the judge ruled, should be split in two, one for operating systems, one for software. For a moment, it seemed that the empire of logic would fracture under its own weight. Investors panicked, competitors celebrated. Employees felt betrayed by the same world they believed they'd served. Gates stood before his team and told them quietly, "We built something good." That doesn't change because people misunderstand it. There was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. Years of relentless work now distilled into a single headline: Gates loses. The order to split the company would later be overturned on appeal, but the damage to his image was lasting. For the first time, the man who had defined the computer age began to question his own reflection. That same year, in January 2000, Gates made a decision that stunned the business world. He announced he would step down as CEO of Microsoft, handing leadership to Steve Ballmer, his college friend and longtime partner in growth. He would remain as chief software architect, but the message was clear. Bill Gates was stepping out of the spotlight. The boy who had built an empire of code was turning inward, toward family, toward purpose, toward questions logic could not answer. When asked why, he said, "I've been thinking about what matters in the long run. I want to focus on things that really improve lives." It wasn't a surrender. It was a recalibration. Long before the trial, Gates and his wife Melinda had begun discussing how their wealth might serve the world. They had read reports of children dying from preventable diseases, malaria, polio, rotavirus, illnesses that barely existed in wealthy nations. The statistics haunted them. In 2000, they formalized their mission as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a global effort to fight poverty, improve healthcare, and expand education. It began with one principle: all lives have equal value. For Gates, it was another kind of problem solving. Only this time, the bugs were in society itself. He approached philanthropy like engineering: collect data, analyze root causes, measure outcomes, iterate solutions. Malaria was not mystery, it was misallocation. Poverty was not fate, it was fixable. The same relentless logic that had built Microsoft was now pointed toward humanity. As he shifted his focus, Gates began to speak differently. The clipped phrases of the technologist softened into the cadence of the humanitarian. He talked not about processors, but about people. He spent long hours reading reports, meeting doctors, visiting clinics in sub-Saharan Africa. For the first time in decades, he was surrounded not by screens, but by faces, children, families, nurses, working in heat and dust. He later said those trips changed him more than success ever had. You see what a mosquito can do to a child's life, and you realize how small your problems are. In quiet hotel rooms after long days, he would write notes by hand, outlining new initiatives: vaccines, sanitation, education access for girls. Each line was still precise, still logical, but now it pulsed with empathy. Public opinion began to shift. The same man, once criticized as a monopolist, now appeared as a reformer. His wealth, once the symbol of imbalance, became an instrument of global change. In interviews, Gates appeared calmer, almost serene. He still wore sweaters and sneakers, still spoke with that same clipped precision. But there was warmth now, a subtle gravity in his tone. He didn't seek redemption, he practiced contribution. When asked if he was trying to repair his legacy, he smiled and said, "I don't think about legacy. I think about progress." To the world, he had evolved from businessman to benefactor. To himself, he had simply changed focus, from hardware to humanity. Melinda became his equal partner in the mission. She brought empathy where he brought analysis, intuition where he brought systems. Together, they were balance, the human and the logical, the heart and the mind. They built the foundation not as a monument but as a mechanism, a way to connect innovation with compassion. Their work spanned vaccines, sanitation, libraries, agricultural reform, and digital education. At their core was the belief that knowledge, properly distributed, could lift humanity as profoundly as technology once had. Gates often said, "Technology is just a tool. It's what you do with it that changes the world." He had spent his life giving humanity tools. Now he was helping them learn how to use them. As the foundation grew, so did its impact. By 2006, Gates announced he would devote almost all his time to it, slowly stepping away from Microsoft's daily operations. He invited Warren Buffett, his longtime friend and mentor, to join their mission. Buffett agreed, donating billions through his own trust, creating the largest philanthropic alliance in history. When they met, the conversations were not about markets or code, but about meaning. Buffett, ever the philosopher of patience, told him, "You've built the world's best business. Now build the world's best conscience." Gates took it to heart. He began to measure time not in product launches, but in lives saved. Progress was no longer defined by users or units, but by outcomes, by the quiet arithmetic of hope. Despite his transformation, the programmer within him never vanished. He still loved data, systems, patterns. He applied them to education, funding new models for schools that measured learning as feedback, not failure. He believed technology could equalize opportunity, that the same logic once used to democratize computing could now democratize knowledge. His speeches grew reflective, even spiritual in tone. He spoke of human potential as the next frontier of innovation. The world doesn't get better by itself. It gets better when we make it so. For the boy who once lived among the logic of machines, this was something close to poetry. In the late 2000s, Gates began appearing again on world stages, not as the CEO of Microsoft, but as a kind of global professor. He lectured on climate, on pandemics, on progress. His PowerPoint slides were replaced by graphs of human lives, vaccination rates, literacy curves, sanitation maps. He spoke with urgency but without ego, the cadence of a man finally fluent in both data and empathy. Audiences leaned in not to be dazzled but to be reassured. There was something comforting about his steadiness, a mind that once conquered complexity, now using it to calm chaos. He was no longer the face of the digital revolution. He was the voice of its conscience. Even amid this transformation, life remained human, imperfect, fragile. Years later, his marriage to Melinda would end quietly but painfully, a reminder that even titans of logic cannot always decode emotion. He faced criticism for influence, transparency, and scale, but through every challenge, he stayed anchored to one belief: that good data, like good intention, could heal the world. He once said, "The world is complicated." That doesn't mean we stop trying to make it simpler. It was the distilled essence of his life: a mathematician's faith in reason, a human's faith in progress. By his 60s, Gates had become something almost mythic, a bridge between two centuries, between the age of invention and the age of restoration. He had moved from creation to correction, from empire to empathy. The same mind that once optimized machines now optimized mercy. He often compared philanthropy to software updates, constant improvement, never perfection. You fix one bug, you find another, but the program keeps running. He laughed when he said it. The laughter of a man who understood both the persistence and the beauty of imperfection. From his lakeside home, he began to rise early, read for hours, and walk along the water. He spoke less now, listened more. The rain of Seattle no longer felt confining. It sounded like rhythm. He still visited Microsoft occasionally, meeting with younger engineers who grew up idolizing him. He told them to stay curious, to think ethically, to remember that innovation is not just power, but stewardship. When one asked what drove him after all he'd accomplished, he smiled and said, "The same thing that drove me at 15, curiosity." The boy who once sought order in machines had found it, at last, in himself. He had built a kingdom of logic, then turned it toward mercy. He had learned that the greatest code is compassion, and that even perfection must serve purpose. Bill Gates had once taught computers to speak. Now he was teaching humanity to listen. He had lived long enough to see his empire become infrastructure, his wealth become wellness, his curiosity become compassion. And in quiet moments, when the rain fell on Lake Washington, he could almost hear it. The faint hum of the old teletype terminal still whispering why. This time he no longer needed an answer. The mind that built machines had turned inward and found peace. Chapter 6. The first years of the new millennium arrived softly over Lake Washington. Morning mist drifted across the water. Crows called from the pines. Inside his home, a house made of glass and screens, its walls pulsing gently with data, Bill Gates read alone by the light of an overcast dawn. He was no longer a chief executive, no longer the impatient prodigy pacing conference rooms at midnight. He was a man in transition, half engineer, half philosopher, still asking questions, but of a quieter kind. His life had shifted from growth to giving. The emails that filled his inbox were no longer about product launches or quarterly targets. They were dispatches from doctors in Malawi, teachers in Mumbai, climate researchers in Norway. Every message was a small window into the state of humanity, its pain, its progress, its promise. And every morning he opened those windows one by one. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had grown into the largest private philanthropy in history. Headquartered in Seattle's South Lake Union District, its glass buildings gleamed under the gray sky, modern, transparent, deliberate. Inside, teams worked on problems of staggering scale, eradicating polio, improving vaccine distribution, reforming education, reinventing sanitation. The office smelled not of circuitry now, but of paper, coffee, and possibility. Gates walked the halls slowly, greeting researchers by name. He no longer barked orders, he asked questions. What's the data say? What are we missing? How many kids are we talking about? He treated the foundation like an engineering project. Break the problem into parts, test, measure, iterate. But where Microsoft had pursued speed, the foundation demanded patience. Lives could not be debugged overnight. When critics accused him of trying to engineer humanity, he simply said, "We're not trying to control the world. We're trying to make it fairer." Melinda remained his counterpart in both mission and temperament. Where he gravitated toward numbers, she gravitated toward stories, names, faces, feelings. She would return from field visits, carrying the weight of people's voices. He would translate those voices into spreadsheets of action. Their balance gave the foundation its rhythm, heart and mind working as one circuit. Together they met with presidents and farmers, scientists and students. They traveled to vaccination drives in Kenya, classrooms in rural China, clean water initiatives in India. Each trip reminded them that progress was not abstract. It was a face, a hand, a heartbeat. Late at night, on long flights home, Gates would stare out the window at the curve of the earth below, glowing faintly in the dark. He would whisper almost to himself, "It's all connected, isn't it?" Melinda would nod. "Yes," she'd say. "It always was." Throughout these years, one friendship endured as constant: Warren Buffett. The two men, so different in style yet identical in curiosity, met often in quiet rooms filled with laughter and learning. Buffett loved Gates's analytical ferocity. Gates loved Buffett's calm wisdom. Their conversations roamed from global markets to moral philosophy, from vaccines to probability. In 2006, Buffett pledged to donate the majority of his fortune, more than $30 billion, to the Gates Foundation. It was the largest charitable gift in history. Gates accepted it, not as triumph, but as trust. He told reporters, "Warren has always said that money is just a claim on resources. Now we have to use those claims wisely." Together they began what would become the Giving Pledge, inviting the world's wealthiest individuals to commit most of their fortunes to philanthropy. It was less a campaign than a quiet revolution, capitalism learning humility. Even as the foundation consumed most of his time, Gates never stopped studying. He read 5 or 6 books a week: science, history, biographies, economics. He wrote long reviews on his blog, Gates Notes, turning personal curiosity into public syllabus. He devoured data on renewable energy, pandemic preparedness, and agricultural innovation. When he couldn't find a solution, he funded one. When he couldn't fund one, he found someone who could. Visitors to his office noticed shelves lined not with trophies, but with notebooks. Hundreds of them, filled in his tidy handwriting. Each page was a thought under construction: questions on population growth, graphs of carbon output, sketches of toilet designs for the developing world. He often said, "I still feel like that kid at Lakeside, only now the computer is the world." Around 2010, Gates began to focus deeply on climate change. He saw it not only as an environmental crisis, but as a systems failure, a misalignment of energy, economics, and empathy. He founded TerraPower, a company exploring next-generation nuclear reactors. He funded breakthroughs in solar storage, carbon capture, and green agriculture. He spoke of innovation pipelines with the same fervor he once used for software. To him, saving the planet was a design problem: reduce emissions, increase efficiency, maintain equity. He built models showing how to reach net zero by 2050. He believed that progress, properly funded and measured, could still outpace catastrophe. When asked why he cared so much about a problem he would not live to see solved, he answered softly, "Because somebody will live with what we leave behind." In 2015, during a TED Talk watched by millions, Gates issued a warning. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. The audience applauded politely, unaware of how prophetic the moment would become. 5 years later, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world. As nations locked down, the clip of that talk resurfaced. Headlines called him the man who predicted it, but prediction had never been the point. Preparation was. Through his foundation, Gates funded vaccine research, testing networks, and global distribution systems. He worked with the World Health Organization, coordinating manufacturing for billions of doses. His emails once again filled with equations, only this time they measured lives saved instead of market share. For weeks, he appeared on screens from his home office, calm amid chaos, explaining R values and epidemiology with the patience of a teacher. To some, he became a voice of reason, to others a target of fear and conspiracy. He absorbed both quietly, replying only, "Truth doesn't need volume, it needs consistency." Fame had never sat comfortably with him. He preferred spreadsheets to spotlights, but now he was everywhere. The billionaire savior to some, the symbol of global influence to others. Every word he spoke echoed through billions of devices still running on his code. He knew this irony too well. He had built the platforms that now amplified both knowledge and noise. When asked if the criticism bothered him, he smiled faintly. "It's part of scale. When you make something everyone uses, you hear from everyone." Then, after a pause, "It just means we still have work to do on trust." By 2021, Gates's marriage ended. After 27 years, he and Melinda chose separate paths but shared missions. The announcement was calm, factual, without bitterness. Privately, he wrestled with regret. He realized that mastery of systems did not guarantee mastery of self. He had built the world's most efficient company and one of its most effective foundations, but relationships, unlike programs, resist optimization. He spoke little about it publicly. Only once did he say, "Even after all you learn, there are still things you don't understand until you lose them." It was the closest he had ever come to poetry. In his late 60s, Gates entered a new role, elder statesman of technology. He advised young founders, mentored scientists, appeared at summits not to sell, but to listen. At gatherings like the Munich Security Conference or COP climate talks, he sat not in the front row, but among researchers. He asked questions more than he answered. He wanted to learn what came next. Younger entrepreneurs still spoke of him with reverence. Some saw a mentor, others a relic. He accepted both. That's how it should be, he said. If they don't surpass us, then we failed. Wealth had long since ceased to motivate him. He had pledged to give away nearly everything, leaving his children comfortable but challenged. He spoke openly about the moral hazard of excess. You can only eat 3 meals a day, he joked. After that, it's just storage. Instead, he found meaning in measurement, counting not dollars, but outcomes. Each annual foundation report read like a software changelog: progress made, bugs remaining, updates planned. He knew perfection was impossible, but the pursuit itself gave structure to the soul. That's what progress is, he wrote. Not the absence of failure, but the refusal to stop improving. As the world digitized fully, smartphones, cloud networks, artificial intelligence, Gates began to look back at the first blinking cursor of DOS and marvel at the distance traveled. He saw his fingerprints everywhere, faint but indelible. He once said to an interviewer, "I don't think about legacy in terms of names. Legacy is whether the tools you built still help people after you're gone." The journalist asked if he thought they would. Gates smiled. They already do. Every time someone learns something new because they have access to information, that's legacy. Occasionally, he visited the old Lakeside School in Seattle. The teletype terminal was long gone, replaced by sleek laptops and touchscreens. Students crowded around him, curious, unafraid. He told them stories of paper tape and punch cards, of staying up all night for a single successful line of code. They laughed, not quite believing such a primitive age existed. Before leaving, he wrote on the classroom whiteboard, "Curiosity is capital. Invest it wisely." Then he paused, smiled, and added beneath it, "And don't forget to have fun." By the mid-2020s, his foundation had helped vaccinate more than 1 billion children. Polio teetered on the edge of eradication. Dozens of new schools and health initiatives bore no nameplates, only results. He began speaking of time as his final currency. He spent it on reading, reflection, and quiet dinners with friends. He spoke less of computing, more of compassion. To young audiences, he said, "The biggest thing I've learned is that intelligence without empathy is incomplete." The room would fall silent, students realizing the sentence contained the map of his life. Evenings at the lake became rituals. He would walk along the shore as the sky turned copper, his footsteps crunching on wet gravel. Sometimes he carried a tablet to take notes, sometimes only thought. He listened to the wind, the distant hum of city lights, the soft ping of a message from across the world. The digital and the natural coexisted peacefully now. He was no longer chasing the future, he was part of it. An old line of code still running quietly in the background, essential but unseen. He had once dreamed of giving every home a computer. In the end, he gave every generation a compass. He taught that innovation without empathy is machinery, and empathy without innovation is wish. He had lived through empires and errors, through triumph and trial, and emerged not as legend, but as lesson. Now, as the light faded on Lake Washington and the world's screens glowed softly in the dark, Bill Gates could rest in the simple truth that had guided him from the beginning. Progress is never owned. It is rented, and the rent is due every day. And so he kept paying in curiosity, in compassion, in quiet persistence. The boy who once asked why had spent a lifetime answering it, and the man he became left the question open for the rest of us. Chapter 7. By the mid-2020s, the world had settled into rhythms he had once only imagined. Computation was no longer confined to boxes on desks. It flowed invisibly through phones, cars, cities, even farms. Every object carried a fragment of logic. Every household pulsed with quiet automation. In that diffusion of intelligence lay Bill Gates's true design: software as atmosphere, everywhere and nowhere at once. He watched this new world unfold, not with pride, but with a kind of scientific wonder. When reporters asked if he missed the old excitement of shipping code, he smiled. "The code's still shipping," he said. "It just doesn't need my keyboard anymore." Each morning began the same. He rose before sunrise, brewed coffee, and sat by the window overlooking Lake Washington. The mist rolled low across the water like a thought taking shape. On the table beside him, piles of reports, malaria data, energy forecasts, AI safety papers. He annotated everything. The margins of his pages were filled with equations, question marks, and the occasional exclamation point. He read not to confirm, but to confront. Every page was a challenge to think again. To him, curiosity was still capital, the only currency that did not devalue with age. The global landscape was changing faster than even he had predicted. Artificial intelligence had entered daily life. Algorithms wrote music, diagnosed disease, generated language. Old fears resurfaced, of machines replacing meaning. When asked whether he feared AI, Gates shook his head. "Fear doesn't help," he said. "Alignment does." He believed technology mirrored its maker. If built with empathy, it could magnify human potential. If built without, it could distort it. He funded research into safety, ethics, and transparency, pushing for what he called a moral operating system. "We learned to give computers instructions," he told an audience in Davos. "Now we must teach them values." The hall fell silent, the hum of translation headsets fading like static. In that silence, his words lingered, part warning, part prayer. From time to time, Gates returned to Microsoft's campus. It had changed beyond recognition. Gleaming glass towers, autonomous shuttles, labs glowing with quantum machines. Young engineers stopped mid-conversation when they saw him. The founder walking quietly among the algorithms his mind had once seeded. He never stayed long. He preferred to listen, to watch the next generation at work. In one lab, a researcher demonstrated code that could predict protein folding. In another, an AI assistant recited Shakespeare in dozens of voices. He nodded, hands in pockets, smiling softly. "You're all building the future," he said. "Just remember to leave room for the human." The words sounded simple, but in his tone was a lifetime of lessons about power, humility, and the weight of invention. In his private journals, Gates wrote often about time, how it had once been an enemy, now an ally. In youth, he had raced it. In age, he studied it. He calculated how long a vaccine takes to reach a remote village, how many minutes of solar power the Earth receives each day, how a single generation could reshape destiny. He no longer sought to control time. He wanted only to spend it well. "Time," he wrote, is the only non-renewable resource that can still create infinite results. It was the closest he came to poetry, though he would never admit it. Over the years, Gates became a mentor to a quiet network of dreamers, scientists, educators, founders, policymakers. He called them builders. They met in small circles, no press, no ceremony. They discussed fusion energy, gene editing, sustainable farming. Gates would sit slightly hunched, listening more than speaking, interjecting only to clarify a formula or test an assumption. When one young engineer apologized for a failed prototype, Gates smiled. "Failure's the unit test of progress," he said. "If it runs perfectly the first time, you didn't aim high enough." The room laughed softly. Tension dissolved. It was the same dry wit that had once filled Microsoft's late-night coding marathons, only now directed towards saving lives instead of debugging lines. By his early 70s, Gates's focus on climate had deepened into mission. He published How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, not as manifesto but manual. Charts replaced rhetoric, logic replaced despair. He traveled to melting glaciers and solar farms, stood before heads of state and schoolchildren alike, and explained the math of survival. He wasn't preaching apocalypse, he was mapping possibility. "We're not doomed," he said. "We're delayed." But delay is reversible. Under his guidance, the foundation invested in clean cement, carbon capture, and alternative fertilizers. He partnered with farmers in Africa, engineers in Denmark, financiers in Singapore, weaving an invisible alliance of pragmatists. He believed climate action needed not slogans but systems, and in systems he found his peace. Beyond climate, Gates saw another silent revolution: digital health. During the pandemic, the world had learned that data could save lives as surely as medicine. He pushed for a global disease monitoring network, satellites, sensors, labs, all feeding into real-time analysis. It was, in a sense, another operating system. Not for computers, but for humanity itself. He called it Health OS. Not a product, a philosophy. Every human connected, every illness visible, every response coordinated. "If we can debug software," he said, "surely we can debug suffering." As he grew older, Gates spoke more of mortality. He did not fear it, he examined it. He once told a journalist, "I don't think of death as an end. I think of it as a handoff." He wanted to ensure the systems he built would outlive him, that philanthropy itself could run autonomously, self-updating long after its architect was gone. He rewrote the foundation's governance, training new leaders, decentralizing power. He didn't want a monument, he wanted a mechanism that could adapt. In quiet moments, he walked the foundation's corridors at night. The fluorescent lights dimmed, the city outside asleep. He would pause by the window, look at the skyline, and whisper, "Keep improving." It was both command and farewell. The children who once learned typing on Windows 95 had grown into leaders themselves. They now ran companies, NGOs, laboratories. Some quoted his words in speeches, others rebelled against them. He found it amusing. "Every generation needs someone to correct," he said. "That's how progress works." When asked how he hoped the next wave of innovators would differ, he replied without hesitation, "Kinda." It was a single word, but it carried the gravity of decades. Home remained his sanctuary. The estate by the lake was quiet, minimal, alive with technology, yet peaceful. The walls projected art when he wished, or went blank when he wanted silence. He spent evenings with books or chess or the hum of classical music. Friends who visited found him content, though never idle. Sometimes he coded small scripts just to keep his hands fluent, tiny programs that tracked reading lists or optimized irrigation for the garden. It wasn't work, it was meditation. "It's still the purest joy I know," he said, "making something work." The scale of his reach sometimes unsettled him. A comment he made in passing could move markets. A funding decision could redirect global research. He tried to treat influence as he once treated code, carefully, line by line. He built checks into his own systems, advisory boards, peer reviews, independent audits. He wanted transparency, even if it slowed him down. "Power without feedback corrupts intelligence," he said. "It makes you forget what the real world feels like." So he kept seeking feedback from scientists, teachers, even critics, especially critics. He believed dissent was a debugging tool for democracy. Every few years, Gates reunited with Steve Ballmer and Paul Allen's family. They reminisced about the motel in Albuquerque, the clatter of the first terminal, the letters typed on paper tape. They laughed at how primitive it all seemed. Then someone would fall silent, remembering how far it had all gone. When Paul Allen passed in 2018, Gates wrote a tribute that read like an elegy to his own youth. "He taught me that brilliance means nothing without curiosity, and that friendship is the best partnership you'll ever build." He kept a photograph of the two of them beside his desk, two boys surrounded by machines, unaware they were inventing an era. In his final decade of public life, Gates became less a technologist and more a teacher. Universities invited him to speak on ethics, history, systems thinking. He refused honorary degrees, preferring dialogue to ceremony. In one lecture at Cambridge, he told students, "We built machines that think faster than we do. Now we have to think deeper than they can." Applause filled the hall, but he merely nodded. He was not preaching genius. He was advocating balance. Progress, he believed, must always pause long enough to consider consequence. In essays, he began to describe life as an endless act of repair. He compared the world to an old program, complex, patched, evolving. "You never get to rewrite it from scratch," he said. "You just keep improving the version you're given." It was humility disguised as code. He no longer believed in utopia, only in iteration. He found comfort in the idea that even imperfection could be optimized. In 2030, Gates sat down for what he called his last big interview. It wasn't televised live. He preferred recorded calm. He spoke about learning, loss, and the simple wonder of discovery. When asked what he hoped the next century would remember about him, he paused for a long time. "Maybe just that I cared about improvement." Not perfection, improvement. The interviewer smiled. "That's a very programmer's answer." Gates laughed softly. "It's the only kind I know." As the years passed, his pace slowed, but his mind remained luminous. He divided his time between Seattle and quiet retreats, mountains, libraries, gardens. He wrote essays on progress, published reflections on failure, encouraged others to learn from his mistakes as much as his successes. He never called them memoirs. He called them patch notes. Each one ended the same way. "Keep learning. keep building, keep kind. In the twilight of his life, as illness or age began to whisper, Gates found comfort in routine. Books, long walks, the steady rhythm of thought. Friends noticed he smiled more now, laughed more easily. He no longer chased outcomes. He cherished process. One evening, watching the sun dip behind the Olympic mountains, he turned to a friend and said quietly, "It's strange. The world runs on code I wrote in my 20s. But the best thing I ever did was learn to listen." The friend asked, "To who?" He replied, "To everyone. The data, the doctors, the farmers, the silence." He had spent a lifetime translating curiosity into systems and systems into change. He had written the language of the digital age and then taught it to speak human. In every bite of information shared, in every vaccine distributed, in every child learning through a glowing screen, his presence endures, not as a name, but as a logic of compassion. He proved that intelligence, guided by empathy, becomes wisdom. That progress, pursued with humility, becomes legacy. And as the modern world hums with the quiet pulse of computation, beneath the code, beneath the glass and satellites, there remains the faint echo of a boy in a school basement, typing into the unknown, asking a question older than technology itself. Why? Because he believed the answer could make the world better. Chapter 8. The digital age had no single author. It was a tapestry, threads of logic and imagination, profit and purpose, woven by hands that never met but shared the same impulse, to improve. Among them, Bill Gates's thread ran quiet and strong. His algorithm still hummed beneath the skin of civilization. His foundation still turned wealth into vaccines, equations into equity. But his true legacy was not invention, it was perspective. The belief that curiosity, disciplined by reason and softened by compassion, could outlast ambition itself. As the 21st century deepened, that belief became inheritance. Every generation births its builders, the restless, the sleepless, the seekers of pattern in chaos. They rise from garages, classrooms, and screens, whispering the same ancient question, what if? Gates had been one of them once, so had Buffett, with his arithmetic of patience. So had Jobs with his poetry of design. So had Musk with his audacity of scale. Each man, in his own way, carried the same flame, the hunger to turn ideas into structure, thought into substance. They built different empires, but shared one conviction: that human progress is a function of imagination sustained by discipline. Their stories were not perfect. They clashed with failure, pride, fatigue. But that imperfection was the point. Progress, like code, is never finished. It is updated generation by generation, commit by commit, line by imperfect line. By the 2030s, the world Gates helped create was transforming again. Artificial intelligence had matured into infrastructure. Machines wrote, spoke, reasoned, not like humans, but alongside them. Hospitals ran simulations before surgeries. Cities adjusted themselves to traffic and weather in real time. The invisible architecture of software governed the rhythm of daily life. But amid all this, one truth lingered, a truth Gates had spoken long before. Technology is just a tool. In terms of getting the kids working together and motivating them, The teacher is the most important. Even in an age of automation, humanity remained the source code. No algorithm could replicate conscience. No model could simulate meaning. He had once built a machine that could think. Now the world had to remember how to feel. Though Gates had stepped away from public life, his presence remained everywhere. In classrooms lit by tablets, in hospitals powered by data, in the quiet hum of every server farm that kept the world connected. His name appeared less frequently in headlines and more often in textbooks. Students studied his memos the way earlier generations studied letters from inventors. "Don't just build fast," one of his early memos read. "Build right." It became a mantra for the new architects of the digital world, an era defined not by who could build the most, but who could build with conscience. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation continued its work long after his active years. By 2035, it had eradicated polio and reduced malaria deaths by 90%. It funded green infrastructure, vaccine pipelines, and AI-driven agricultural systems in regions once ignored by global markets. Its mission had evolved from charity to continuity, to make progress self-sustaining, not dependent on wealth, but on wisdom. In foundation halls across continents, his portrait hung quietly. No crown, no halo, just a man in glasses looking slightly past the camera, as if seeing the next problem waiting to be solved. Beneath each frame were his own words: "We have more to do." And so, humanity did. The 2040s arrived, not with apocalypse, but with adaptation. Renewable energy powered cities once drowned in smog. The global south became the global engine. Children born in villages with no electricity now worked in labs designing cleaner fuels. It was not utopia, it was iteration, messy, uneven, real. The kind of progress Gates had always believed in. Everywhere, his influence echoed not as ownership, but as origin. The first laptop in a child's hand, the first broadband line in a remote school, the first vaccine delivered by drone to a mountain village. He had never believed technology was destiny. He believed it was leverage. And with that leverage, humanity had lifted itself another inch toward fairness. In his later years, philosophers began to write of Gates as a paradox: the capitalist who became a reformer, the engineer who became a healer, the man of logic who found his peace in compassion. But to those who had known him, there was no paradox, only progression. He had simply kept iterating on systems, on self, on society. One essay called him the architect of conscience. It described his legacy not as a monument, but as an interface, a bridge between technology and empathy. He had once said, "Optimism without action is illusion. Action without empathy is machinery." That line became engraved in universities and startup accelerators alike. It was a new commandment for the digital age. The true measure of a life, Gates believed, was multiplication. Not of money, but of meaning. He once joked that his proudest creation wasn't Windows, but the number of people who'd surpassed him. "That's the point of knowledge," he said. "You pass it on, and it gets better." By the mid-century, a new generation of innovators, many born after his retirement, began to cite him not as an idol, but as a principle. In the same breath as Da Vinci or Edison, they spoke of Gates not for his inventions, but for his intent. He had proven that precision could serve kindness. That intelligence could scale empathy, that ambition, properly harnessed, could cure more than it consumed. In the quiet of his final years, Gates rarely appeared in public. He spent time reading, writing, and visiting his children. He enjoyed walking unrecognized through Seattle's markets, smiling at how the city, his city, had grown into a global capital of innovation. Neighbors saw him sitting by the water at dusk, sketching notes in a small black book. When asked what he was working on, he would smile and say, "Updates." He had stopped building software long ago, but he never stopped updating himself. When he passed, it was not sudden. The world had time to prepare, though few were ready. News spread in silence, headlines simple, tributes sincere. Billions of devices dimmed their screens for a moment. A symbolic gesture for the man who had first lit them. In Seattle, the rain fell lightly that day, and the flag outside the foundation hung still. No ceremony, no spectacle, just quiet gratitude. At the memorial, Warren Buffett spoke last. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "He never stopped asking why, and he never stopped trying to make the answer useful." There was applause, but soft, as if even the crowd knew that silence was the truer tribute. Decades later, his story became required study, not in business schools, but in ethics courses, not as a tale of wealth, but of wisdom. Students wrote essays titled "The Logic of Empathy." Professors quoted him alongside philosophers. Engineers designed new systems named after his principles: open, ethical, iterative. The code he wrote had long since evolved beyond recognition, but the mindset remained intact. Be rigorous, be generous, be curious. His influence no longer required memory. It had become muscle, built into the reflex of civilization. And somewhere, in every quiet room where a programmer works late, in every classroom where a teacher unlocks a child's imagination, in every clinic where a nurse vaccinates a newborn, his spirit hums like background code. He was not a hero, not a saint, not infallible. He was a builder, one who dreamed that logic could serve love. The sleeping tycoon, not asleep in indifference, but resting in legacy. His mind still awake in the circuits of progress, his heart still beating in the data of compassion. For the modern world, his life remains a bedtime story of a different kind, a tale of rest earned, of curiosity unending, of what happens when intellect learns humility. Some build empires to be remembered, others build them so the world itself remembers how to build. He had once said, "We always overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in 10. He proved it true not only in technology but in humanity. From a school terminal in Seattle to the foundation that touched every corner of the earth, he traced a single, unbroken line of curiosity, one that still glows faintly across the map of progress. And somewhere, in the endless hum of servers and satellites, the boy who once asked why is still listening for an answer.